Good afternoon, evening, whatever it is. Thank you all for coming here. We are very happy to have Guido Tabellini from Bocconi University as our main speaker today. And actually, I was just checking out, this is the 49th Barcelona School of Economics lecture. So the 50th, maybe we should do something special. But I'll leave that to the new director. As you know, Joan Monras will take over to the directorship on May 18th. So I'm still currently the director for a few days. So it's great to have this last public gathering to have the lecture of Guido. The representative of Banc Sabadell, who usually is coming to welcome you all, Sofia Rodriguez, was unable to come today because Banc Sabadell today has the General Assembly, and she couldn't come, and anybody else that was at a certain level of responsibility could come today. But I promised them that I would recall and remember that Banc Sabadell has been sponsoring these lectures for as many years as we had them, and it seems like we're gonna have them sponsoring for more years to come, hopefully many. So just to give them thanks for being our sponsors for so many years. And said that, I'm going to give the floor to Marta Reynal, who is going to do the official introduction of Guido. Okay, thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Teresa. So Guido Tabellini needs a little introduction, but it's precisely the magnitude of his contribution that makes an introduction necessary. So his impact is so profound that any serious discussion in modern political economy naturally begins with his work. He's one of the key figures who transform how economists think about the relationship between politics, institutions, culture, and economic development. Guido Tabellini is the Intesa San Paolo Chair in Political Economics at Bocconi University. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in '84, and held positions at Stanford, UCLA, and several Italian universities before joining Bocconi in '94. There, he has served as director and president of IGER and as rector, and he's currently the vice president of Bocconi. He's a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, a fellow of the Econometric Society, a foreign honorary fellow of the American Economic Association, and a recipient of the Irju Jansson Award from the European Economic Association. He has also served as president of both the Econometric Society and the European Economic Association. In addition, he received the John von Neumann Award and the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Economic Finance and Management, among many other honors. Guido Tabellini is one of the architects of the modern frontiers of economics. To understand his influence is to comprehend the transformative impact he has on the social science, a fundamental shift that moved economics towards a deep human understanding of how power, law, and institutions actually work. To speak of Tabellini is to speak of an economist who did not remain confined within the traditional limits of his field, but instead expanded them, building bridge between economics, political science, history, and sociology in a way that has permanently enriched all these disciplines. So at the heart of Guido's contribution lies a very simple but very powerful idea. Economies do not function in isolation from societies that sustain them. His research helped establish that economic outcomes cannot be fully understood through markets alone. They are deeply shaped by institutions and by the beliefs of individuals. This perspective has had important implications in political economy, Guido provided rigorous frameworks to analyze how constitutions, electoral systems, and government accountability affect policy choices and economic performance. His work clarified why some governments succeed in delivering public goods while others fail, offering insights that continue to guide both academic research and real-world policymaking. Equally important is his contribution to the economics of culture. Guido showed how cultural traits, such as trust, respect for others, and civic engagement, can persist across generations and influence economic outcomes centuries later. This line of research opened an entirely new frontier, inspiring many economists to explore how deeply rooted social values shape modern economies. But Guido's relevance is not limited to his intellectual contributions. He stands among the most influential economists of his generation. His textbooks and papers are part of the foundation of modern economics. As a teacher, mentor, and academic leader, he has played a decisive role in shaping generations of economists. His clarity of thought, methodological rigor, and openness to interdisciplinary research have set a precedent for young researchers entering this field. Many of the today leading scholars have been directly or indirectly influenced by his work, carrying forward his approach into new areas and ensuring its lasting impact. Guido's work has also deeply influenced how I think about conflict. When I first began studying ethnic polarization and violence, his research led me to look beyond identities themselves and to focus instead on the institutional and political forces that shape how those identities translate into conflict. Reading his work, I realized that division alone are not enough. What matters is how they are mobilized and under which rules and incentives. For future generations, his legacy will endure, not just in the papers he wrote, but in the way economists think. His work reminds us that economies are human systems, rooted in history and shaped by collective decision. He encourages researchers to move beyond restrictive models and to embrace the complexity of the real world. Today, we recognize more than an outstanding economist. We recognize a thinker who expanded the horizons of his discipline, and a scholar whose ideas will continue to guide and inspire for decades to come. So thank you very much, Guido. It's a privilege to have you here today with us. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Guido Tabellini.
Thank you, Marta, for your very generous words. And I'm very honored and glad to be here and speak in front of you. So I want to talk about a topic that is affecting democracies in many parts of the world, and that is political polarization. We see that voters, and particularly politicians, disagree sharply on not only on normative issues of what should be done, but also on how they interpret facts and how they believe about the consequences of policy. And they have become increasingly intolerant of opposite partisan views. This is a picture taken, this is the sharpest in the US, although this polarization is increasing also in Europe. It takes the form of increased vote shares for extremist parties. Here, this refers to the US. It's a representative survey where they ask respondents to list the most important problems. And you see that polarization and the state of democracy have become more important than inflation, than immigration, not so far away from the economy, which is typically listed as the most important problem. So motivated by this, I would like to present the results of two recent papers that we have been writing that try to dig deeper on what are the mechanisms behind polarization. One mechanism is on the demand side, the other is on the supply side of politics. So on the demand side, we study how voters form their beliefs, and the results of the experiment that I will summarize point to the notion that our beliefs reflect not only, or maybe not so much, the information that we receive and we process, but the social context in which these beliefs are formed. And in particular, I will show that when a specific conflict is made more salient, we tend to become more extreme in our views on the borders that divide this conflict. And this result is important also because it explains how propaganda can work. Propaganda can shape beliefs by changing the salience of different conflicts. So that's the takeaway from the demand side of the analysis. And motivated by this, we then also looked at how politicians communicate. I guess in the literature on politics and economics, there are two views. One view is that propaganda aims to persuade swing voters who are uncertain whether to vote left or right. And this type of propaganda typically converges to the middle to persuade voters who are undecided between two parties. But another view is that propaganda instead is targeted to subset of voters, and it tries to mobilize more extreme core supporters of one party or the other. And so with this priors in mind, we study what happens to rhetoric in the proximity of elections, before elections, after elections. And the striking fact is that rhetoric on Twitter, so on social media, not necessarily always, becomes more polarized before the election. So that suggests that politicians may have an opportunistic motive to polarize the electorate. They're not necessarily driven by their ideology when they choose polarizing propaganda. And when you put together these two aspects, you see that there are complementarities that may reinforce propaganda, because on the demand side, the social context makes voters more receptive to propaganda that increases the salience of conflict. And on the supply side, there are theoretical results that suggest that when the electorate is more divided, the incentive to polarize the electorate further under some conditions becomes even stronger. And I will conclude by arguing that perhaps the diffusion of social media has amplified these complementarities and these mechanisms. So the first paper on the demand side is joint work with my Bocconi colleague Nicola Gennaioli and Frederick Schwerter at the University of Frankfurt University. So here we asked, why do voters disagree on facts? And as I was suggesting, economic research typically emphasizes information to answer this question. It argues that we are exposed to echo chambers. We segregate our news exposure according to our partisan views, or we are subject to distortions in information processing. And so distorted beliefs would result from these mechanisms. What we do in this paper, instead, we explore a different avenue. We argue that our beliefs, what we believe, reflects our social identity as much as, or not necessarily, information processing. And as I said, polarization is driven by the salience of conflict, not necessarily by new information, and I will provide results of an experiment that support this. The background theory behind this idea is social identity theory. This is a large research literature in social psychology that flourished in the 70s and 80s, and that we have formalized in a series of recent papers with Nicola Gennaioli and Giampaolo Bonomi. So let me summarize briefly the key ideas. Take an environment in which individuals have some primitive beliefs on two dimensions of issues. One dimension is an economic dimension, redistribution, or how the market functions. The other dimensions would be moral issues or cultural issues, like what do we want to do with race relations, with gender issues, with immigration. And these primitive beliefs can reflect whatever education, past experience they are given to us. And they are distributed in the population with some normal distribution, mean zero for simplicity and the positive correlation coefficient. And these beliefs define two social cleavages between progressives, those with positive realizations of these beliefs. In the economic domain, they would be economic progressives, or conservatives in the cultural domain, they would be cultural conservatives, opponents of immigration. So this would be the theoretical distribution of these beliefs with mean zero positive correlation. Each observation would be an individual in society. And zero partitions society, as you see, in two blocks. To the right, vertically, we have the cultural progressive. To the left, we have the cultural conservative. There is positive correlation, so conservatives and progressives tend to dominate in both camps. But importantly, there are also mixed types that are actually important for some of the predictions of the theory, that are conservative in one domain and progressive in the other. And so individuals can identify, depending on which conflict dimension is more salient, as an economic progressive or conservative, in which case they see the world as divided between yellow and black, or as cultural progressive and conservatives, in which case they see the world as divided between red and blue. And how they identify, which is their prevalent identity, so they have these two latent political identities, how they see the world affects their beliefs. And in particular, and this is a result that has been discussed also by social psychologists in lab experiment, they slant their beliefs towards the stereotype of the beliefs of their in-group. And so suppose that they identify along the cultural dimension, because the stereotypical conservative is more conservative than the progressive, the stereotype induces them to become more extreme in this dimension of cultural conservativeness. But there are three features of this picture that are important. First, the dividing line is the dividing line between these two opposite identity groups, the in-group and the out-group. Second, the length of the line, so by how much you distort your beliefs, according to the theory, depends, reflects the stereotypes. And the stereotypes reflect the true underlying disagreement of these groups. So if the groups in the primitive beliefs are more different from each other, or more disagreeing, the distortion in the stereotype is greater. The length of the line reflects this disagreement. And the third feature, as you see, is that there are spillover effects. So because being conservative in culture is also correlated in the population with being conservative on the economy, I distort my beliefs in both dimensions. Notice that for these types, identification makes them more polarized on both dimensions. For the mixed types, identification with your cultural group makes you more extreme on the cultural dimension, but it actually moderates your extremism in the economic dimension, because this mixed type is progressive on culture, but it's conservative on the economics. Because the two are correlated, I tend to become more progressive if culture is the relevant identity, and this increased progressiveness moderates my conservatism on this economic dimension. So these are the takeaways from the theory that we had discussed in the past. So what we do in this paper, we design an experiment that allows us to test these predictions. So we have 3 waves of US respondents in an online survey, pre-registered with a large sample. The outcome that we study is their beliefs on 10 issues. Some are facts, some are policy preferences in the economic and in the cultural domain. And the treatment is the sequence of the ordering of the questions that they see. So in the group that we treat with the economic identity, we make you choose an economic enemy, an outgroup. We make you think about an economic outgroup. Okay, so we ask you, I'll show you in a minute, by whom are you going to be, do you feel threatened? And we list a list of economic enemies. Then we ask you your beliefs. Then to have all the information, we ask you what would be your cultural enemies, and then we solicit other questions. In the cultural treatment, we do the same, but we make you think about your cultural enemies, the cultural outgroup. And in the control, we make you think about which animals are more threatening to you, so something that is unrelated to politics. And the enemies are either, for economic treatment, people that would be perceived as enemies by an economic progressive. So if you chose these, you see a list of these 6 people. If you choose one of the 3 in the first line, we label you as economic progressive. If you choose instead communist, trade union, or lazy people, we'll label you as economic conservative. And likewise for the cultural enemies. Okay? Notice that in the economic treatment, people think about economic issues. In the cultural treatment, they think about values and cultural issues. They don't think about parties. So we are priming social groups, which of course are politically salient, but not political parties. Okay, then what are the results? So the first prediction of the theory is that increasing the salience of these conflicts polarizes opinion of opposite economic groups and of opposite cultural groups, depending on the treatment. And this is what we find. So just making you think about enemies without providing any new information raises the disagreement of opposite economic groups, progressive versus conservatives, by this magnitude. The cultural treatment, as you will see, has large effects except in one group of respondents. And this is also true of factual beliefs. So not just your policy preferences, but also factual beliefs. Second, the theory predicts that there are spillover effects across domains. And importantly, this is not due to queuing political parties, because when you interact with party affiliation, the results are very similar. And this is what we find. So on the left here, you see the results on facts, the questions on facts. Here, it's the results on the questions on policy preferences. In the horizontal axis, we measure the progressiveness of the respondents on cultural issues. On the vertical axis, it's the progressiveness of the respondent on the economic issues. The first two diagrams are the economic treatments, the second two, the cultural treatment. The white dots are the control respondents. So you see that in the control group, not surprisingly, progressive and conservatives disagree, and this disagreement is correlated across two dimensions, and they disagree quite a bit. And the dark dots are the average opinions of the economic progressives and the economic conservatives in the treated group, and likewise in the cultural group. So for reasons that maybe we don't have time to discuss, this is not happening for the cultural conservative, but otherwise there is amplification of conflict as predicted. The second prediction that I was mentioning is that stereotypes reflect the kernel of truth. So they reflect underlying disagreements. And so we predict that the treatment effect should be stronger on the issues, on the specific questions out of the 10 questions, where baseline disagreement is stronger. We measure baseline disagreement as disagreement in the control group. So each dot here on the horizontal axis is how much the control group disagrees on this specific issue. And on the vertical axis, we measure the treatment effect for different groups of individuals. And as you see, the treatment effect is stronger on the questions on which the control respondents disagree more. The third prediction, so these two predictions and results relate to the comparison between treated individuals and the control group. Another prediction that you can generate concerns the effect of the treated individuals who are treated economically against the effect of the cultural treatment. So to measure this in a more parsimonious way, given the positive correlation, rather than looking at economic questions or cultural questions, we take the average. So we just look at the general progressivity, taking the average of all 10 questions, of the individuals who are subject to the economic treatment and the individuals who are subject to the cultural treatment. And the theory predicts that when you compare the economically treated to the culturally treated respondents, the switch from ET to CT makes the cultural groups more polarized, right? Because you are making them think about their enemies, and so they become more polarized compared to the economic treatment. And this is what we find. So this is the disagreement between opposite cultural groups in the economic treatment and in the cultural treatment. So they are more polarized, while the economic groups, economic progressives versus economic conservatives, when you switch from ET to CT, they become less polarized. The prediction is actually that the diff in diff difference is statistically significant. This is the diff in diff difference, so the sum of the two differences, that's what we find. So, and moreover, the theory predicts, and this is the intuition for this picture, that this recategorization of conflict occurs because of the mixed types. So it's the mixed types who are changing their view of the world. If you think about it, consider an economic progressive who is also a cultural conservative. If you have the economic treatment, so if you increase his economic identification, he sees himself predominantly as progressive, because that's what he is in the economics domain. When you switch to the cultural identity by emphasizing his cultural enemies, he now thinks of himself as a conservative, because he is conservative in the economic domain. So the switch in identity turns the economic progressive into cultural conservative, and this dimension that defines your identity dominates in your overall view of the world. That's what lies behind this picture, and that's what the data in the experiment say, that the recategorization of your conflict is occurring only among the mixed types, not among the pure types. Now, this is, we think, interesting because it has two implications. The first, it can explain political realignment. So we know in the US that Republicans have gained votes among less educated blue-collar workers, which in the past used to vote Democrats, and now they are voting instead for Trump. And what's the feature of these people? They are economic progressive, they demand more redistribution, but being less educated, they tend to be cultural conservative. And so we have argued in other work that that's an implication of the increased salience of cultural conflict that has made people abandon their class identity and acquire this cultural identity, which explains this realignment. And there is a very interesting book by Didier Ribon in France, Returning to Reims, where he describes his cultural upbringing, his upbringing, and he comes from a working class environment, and he notes, when I was growing up, I grew up in a working class environment, and all my friends, all my relatives were voting communist, but they were male chauvinist, racist, cultural conservative. Now, these same people are all voting Le Pen, because at the time, being communist was the thing to do, and now, instead, this anti-immigrant instance has become much more salient. A second interesting implication is that in some occasions, conflict salience can also reduce internal polarization if it points to an external enemy. So maybe external conflict can also induce a realignment in a direction that is helpful to the functioning of democracy. So summarizing, the ideas here, the takeaway here is that this logic of us versus them is an ingredient in political extremism, and cueing social enemies induces belief polarization, and this in turn can explain changes in beliefs and conflict realignment. And of course, this is relevant for the functioning of political propaganda, because often political propaganda does not provide new information. It just changes the salience of specific issues and specific conflicts. And we see often politicians bashing the outgroup and talking poorly about the outgroup. They do so because in this way they mobilize their core supporters, but of course it also fuels their extremism. The theory, however, stresses that you cannot do this arbitrarily. So a successful politician is somebody who fuels conflict which is salient, which is latent. So it must resonate with pre-existing social cleavages. And the final implication of all of this is that maybe the information-based interventions that have attracted so much attention from economists are less important, and they are in a sense the symptom and not the cause of the polarization. So that's the first paper I wanted to talk about. The second paper is joint with my Bocconi colleague Tito Boeri and with a PhD student at Bocconi, Nina Nikiforova. And as I was anticipating, it's motivated by these opposite views about the effects of elections. One view, which is probably the dominant view, is that elections tend to have a moderating effect on opposite politicians, because to convince the swing voter, you need to converge to the middle. But as I was saying, there is other work, some of it done by Giacomo Ponzetto with Ed Glaser many years ago, that instead diverging and polarizing the electorate may be helpful to politicians because it allows them to mobilize core voters. But the key idea in the second view is not so much the margin, whether I vote for Trump versus abstaining, or I vote for Trump versus Biden. The key idea in the second strand of literature is that there is an asymmetry in attention. So if I am a core supporter of Trump, I am more attentive to what Trump says. And if that is so, and if Trump can target his propaganda to a subset of his voters, then he has an incentive to diverge, because his supporters want him to be more extreme on the right, and because the progressives are not listening to him as carefully, he's not mobilizing the backlash of the progressive voters. So the key assumption here is that if there is targeting of voters, if voters can be targeted, then politicians have actually an incentive to diverge. And we show in other work, they also have an incentive to polarize the electorate, because if the electorate is more polarized, given this asymmetry of attention, they are less likely to move to the opponent. Of course, there is a lot of literature on this, but I think it's fair to say that the evidence is inconclusive. And what we do in this work is to study the communication strategy of political leaders on Twitter X across countries. And then we ask, does this rhetoric become more or less polarized before elections? We focus on the divide between populist and non-populist politicians, because we think that this is the dominant form of competition now in most democracies. And also, these populist platforms are actually fairly similar across countries, and they are also linked. These political leaders follow each other across countries. Of course, populism has been studying a lot, but mostly on the demand side. And here instead we study it on the supply side. And we ask, do we see convergence or divergence in the rhetoric of these different types of politicians as the election approaches? So our data set consists of a large number of tweets of political leaders, not of all politicians, but either candidates for position of president or prime minister, or leaders of the main parties in 15 countries. We ask ChatGPT whether this political leader is populist or non-populist. We do a lot of robustness on that. Then we adapt a methodology that was pioneered by Gensko, Shapiro, and Teddy in Econometrica some years ago, which is very nice. It estimates the ease with which you can predict the politician's type, whether he's populist or non-populist, conditional on a biagram. in the set of biograms that are contained in the tweets of these politicians. This measure has the advantage of being robust to finite sample bias. It's robust to trends in verbosity. Politicians tend to be more active near the election. This is reflects is not biased by that, and it's also transparent. So if you did this with artificial intelligence, you would also be able to predict these differences, but in a less transparent way. And if, say, populist and non-populist is correlated with gender or age or other features, you would be confounding this. Here, instead, we estimate a Poisson model which takes into account the other observable features of these politicians. This measure of partisanship, so the ease with which you can predict the politician's type, turns out to be larger and more volatile than those estimated by the same paper by Gensko, Shapiro, and Teddy in US congressional speeches. Then we study the patterns of polarization around the elections, essentially in a diff-in-diff methodology, exploiting the fact that elections have different dates in different countries. So we estimate this equation. So the dependent variable here is how the partisanship of politician I in quarter T, so how easy it is to predict his type given the words that he used in that quarter. We regress it on a politician fixed effect, a quarter fixed effect, a dummy variable for being at minus 3/4 before the election, -2, -1, up to +3/4 around the election. So the comparison here, the effect of beta, measures the effect of being at this quarterly distance from the election relative to the remaining quarters who are more than 3/4 away from each election. So on average, you are so polarized during this period, and we compare how polarized your speech is at different quarters in the selection window relative to the remaining quarters of the selection period. And then we control, this makes no difference, but to avoid omitted variable bias, we have a dummy variable for the closest election period. So if there are shocks that occur during the selection period, would be captured by this dummy variable. And this is what we find. So 0 is the quarter of the election. And as you see, starting about 3/4 before, rhetoric becomes more polarized, and then it returns to the usual average. And that's very robust to defining the election window here. And the size is quantitatively relevant. So 2 years after the election, so somewhere here after you're away from the election, if you observe a single tweet, you raise the predictability of who sent the tweet by 6 percentage points. So from neutral priors of 50%, one tweet gives you a probability of 56%. The effect is 70% larger during election quarters, which is roughly the same event that is associated with the refugee crisis in 2015, a very polarizing event in this sample of countries. Then we dig deeper, and I don't have time for this, so I will have to stop soon, into other features of the data. So we look at partisanship with the same methodology within topics and between topics. So between topics means the tweet talks about immigration. What does that tell me about whether you're populist or not? And here is the, of all tweets about immigration, do you use different words as populist or non-populist when you speak about immigration? There is evidence of a pre-electoral cycle on both, but it is stronger between topics. We are trying to understand better why we think this is maybe related to lower power of the test in this sample. The last result that I want to emphasize, that I don't have on a slide, just on the last two lines, is that based on their diagrams, we can measure on the entire sample how distinctive a topic is of being populist. So a populist would talk a lot more about immigration on average. A non-populist would talk a lot more about climate change on average. And then we find that non-populist topics like climate change or institutional issues become more distinctive of non-populist politicians before the election. So there is a cycle in populist distinctiveness which, to say it in other words, implies or can be interpreted as saying that non-populist politicians increase the salience of the topics that are relevant for them, about which they talk more often. They increase the salience of these non-populist topics before the election. This does not happen for populist politicians, so it's asymmetric. We cannot say who, actually I misspoke, we cannot say whether it's the non-populist politicians who is attracting the salience to these topics, or it's the populist politicians who is shedding away from it. So we cannot attribute who is responsible for this change in salience, but clearly it is there. So the takeaway from the supply side is that elections tend to have a polarizing effect on political rhetoric on Twitter X. I don't want to claim that this is true of any political communication. In fact, there are findings in the literature that if you look at party manifestos, this is not the case. So on social media, we find this polarizing effect of elections, and in particular, the non-populist topics become more distinctive, more predictive of the non-populist politicians. So overall, to us, this suggests that when politicians diverge and maybe seek to polarize the electorate, there is also an opportunistic component behind this behavior. It's not just driven by their ideology. And this is also evidence that they compete for different groups of voters, because if they competed for the same swing voters, they would have an incentive to converge. So to conclude, if you put together the demand and the supply side, of course this is suggestive, what I am saying now, and should be taken with some grain of salt, but we have seen that conflict salience fuels voters' extremism, and so provides a mechanism for political propaganda to polarize the electorate. We see that tweets become more polarized ahead of the elections, which suggests that politicians do so to target and mobilize their core voters. And if you think about why has polarization increased, and there is evidence by Melikov that it has increased more in the areas where mobile technology became more diffused, maybe a plausible conjecture is that social media diffusion is playing a role in the rise of polarization for two reasons. On the demand side, we know that making a conflict salience has become easier on social media because it attracts more attention. And so this makes polarizing propaganda that evokes conflict naturally more salient in social media than in traditional media. And on the other hand, these social media allow much better targeting opportunities of voters because you can direct your messages to a very selected group of voters, and you get feedback on what these voters think. And so in our framework, these better targeting opportunities also reinforces the incentives of politicians to diverge and to engage in this polarizing propaganda. So that's the sense in which these two sides, demand and supply, may be joined together, and social media may have had these effects. Let me stop here and take comments.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the first part of your presentation. You talk about the importance of culture, but if we look at, for example, the roll call votes, and over the past 200 years in the United States, and if you look at the nominate scores associated with these roll call votes, then it seems that what policymakers care about. First dimension is always economics. Second dimension is sometimes cultural, and sometimes it is not. So sometimes it is slavery question, or nowadays it's like this social progressive questions. But in some time periods, it's about agriculture versus urban population. Sometimes it's about silver standard versus golden standard. And I'm wondering, what do you think within your framework, why sometimes culture becomes very important so that it can even overtake the traditional economic cleavages, and sometimes it becomes so unimportant that it's not even the second dimension on which political parties compete.
Right. So that's a very interesting question, and we don't know much about the answer. We know that culture started becoming more important in the work by, for instance, Gensko, Shapiro, and Teddy in the mid-90s, and then even more so in the last 2 decades. I think in the US, probably the election of a black president was instrumental in increasing the salience of race relations, and you see that your race is now much more predictive of whether you are Democrat or Republican. So I don't know what the answer to this question is. It deserves to be studied. So we don't know which conflicts are salient and why in particular periods. I can speculate as to why culture has become more salient in the last 2 decades, or maybe 2.5 or 3 decades. And I would point to 2 notions. The first is that the conflict, economic conflict also, is very much between more educated and less educated people. And so even economic shocks like the China shock or technological shocks contribute to pit educated and uneducated people against each other. And of course, an important distinction between these 2 groups of people is also their value system and their cultural attitudes. And so in some work with Nicola, we find some correlation between, for instance, China shocks and your attitudes towards immigration and race relations that are supportive of this. The second shock that may have played a role, of course, is the immigration shocks that have become so important in many countries. So there is an element of contingency to the importance of culture now. I think it is indisputable that culture is more salient. Why was agriculture or maybe climate change or something else more salient? I think it depends. I don't know. It should be studied, and probably the politicians have a role. So we should not think of exogenous shocks as driving these salience conflict, but also the interaction between politicians and the external environment.
Yes, but please raise your very clear. Okay.
No, I was thinking about the impact of political competition on all what you were saying about the supply side, because in fact the last thing that you said I think is quite relevant. The choice of topics that polarize depend pretty much on what the politician is interested in. The spin doctors look in the surveys for depending on the structure of competition, look for issues that can polarize the opposite parties. So divide and conquer. Divide the opposite parties in order to win, not polarize between you and me, but polarize them to be able in a political competition that is different from the US, where you only have two. Well, even in the US, you could try to polarize Democrats on the lines that separate them the most. Okay, they do that here in Spain. No, there are some topics. You look at the surveys, and there are some topics that people on the right are very mostly polarized, and you can go on that side and go to propose a law that will polarize the other side in order to improve your political position. So I wonder if you have thought about what are the implications of the structure of the political competition on the relevance of polarization and the choice of topics by politicians, because this is at the end, I think that these topics are not exogenous, they are chosen by the politicians.
That's, as I was suggesting, really the next research question that is suggested by this framework is trying to answer what you've asked. And I don't think there is a lot of high quality work that I know of. Maybe I'm familiar with the work of economists, less so with that of political scientists. But let me tell you two things that I know from this research on the structure of political competition. So these results are stronger, the one I've shown, in countries that are governed by either plurality rule or in presidential elections, where you typically have two-party candidates. So these are the systems in which you would think that competition is strongest. The results are there, but weaker in proportional and parliamentary elections where you have many parties. So I don't think they are an artifact of strange features of competition. They arise in standard environments of political competition. The second, we're trying now to add a theoretical model that somehow makes the prediction of the second paper more precise. What we are finding is that when you choose the salience, so when you try to model how do politicians choose whether to make issue A or issue B more salient, they find it optimal in a simple environment to increase the salience of the issue that is more relevant for their targetable voters, for their core voters. So if Trump supporters care about immigration more than about climate change, Trump invests in making immigration even more salient because that provides him with an advantage. You are right that there could be also a dimension of dividing the supporters of the opponent, and we haven't thought carefully about that. But I think these are very interesting questions.
Now we have Xavier, then Giacomo, then Jordi. And then I will ask for more.
Mine is more a clarification question on how do you define populism? So I was not quite clear on that, more on the second part of your presentation. And it seemed to me that you associated more to the right than to the left topics. So is that populism only exists in the right? Or so in a sense, what are the characteristics of populism that you are targeting to?
So we asked artificial intelligence, ChatGPT and Claude, we get very similar results. Tell me whether this political leader, so it's a property of leaders, not of parties, this political leader, these are well-known figures, there are about 30 politicians per country, whether he's populist. By populist, we mean what the standard literature means. So somebody who emphasizes the will of the people against the elite, who emphasizes the benefit of direct democracy. Left and right is not a dimension. So we take the standard definition of populist in political science and we give it to the prompt. Now, so there, you are right that in our sample, about 1/3 of politicians are populist. They are both right and left, but they are more likely to be right-wing in our sample. That could be an artifact of the sample of countries that we consider. We also have done a finer analysis, allowing for the presence of 4 types: left-wing populist, right-wing populist, left-wing non-populist, right-wing non-populists. The results are very similar, but they are driven by the populist-non-populist distinction. The left-right distinction does not give rise to the similar electoral pattern. It's much less pronounced. One interpretation is that these left-right politicians are less in competition with each other. So if you look at whether populist versus non-populist sit on opposite sides of government and coalition, they do most of the time. The left and right politicians in our sample sometimes are both in government, sometimes are both in opposition. So we argue that the competition between the populists is much more defining and intense than between left and right in this particular sample period.
Very interesting. I guess you already started answering this, because I was wondering about, what theory you have for the second result and how it relates to the first. Because naturally, as you were kindly saying, I easily can think of why this playing to your own base leads parties to adopt different platforms. But then what they want to emphasize, I think off the top of my head, I would say, well, you want to emphasize things on which the two groups of voters were something very different, but this they would do symmetrically. Then you want to emphasize something that where your voters really care about the difference, and these would be more distinctive because it's their salience. But these would just purely be saying, look, I have some limited information to tell you what my product is, and let's focus on what you really care about, the superiority of my product. The question is, do you think that it's an attempt to change the salience versus just exploiting what salience is there, which I feel could give the same result? And that a more off left field question, what do you think this leaves the idea which Tommaso Nannicini had with experiments too, that what you should be doing is signaling valence to everybody rather than emphasizing ideological cleavages? And of course, that was municipal elections. It's a different story, maybe. But.
Right. So yeah, valence is missing from our analysis. We have nothing to say on valence, and you're right. So that means to stay away from that. Otherwise, what the theory points to is the notion that in the theory we envisage an environment in which communication aims to do 3 things: to communicate your policy position, and if voters are sufficiently asymmetric in the information that they get, if they are sufficiently large, the targeted voters, then you have an incentive to diverge. Second, persuasion may aim at changing voters' bliss points. And there, if it has the features of our identity theory, namely that if I try to change your views and you are a right-wing voters and I say, hey, these immigrants are all raping our women, this may convince you to become more conservative, but it is also moving the progressives in the opposite direction. So if you make this assumption that when Trump changes his voters' bliss points, it has a backlash effect on his opponent, but his opponents are less attentive, then as long as the electorate is sufficiently divided to begin with, both politicians an incentive to make the electorate even more divided, because that reduces the mobility from one party to the other. And the third feature of communication is this one on salience, and you want to increase the salience, put costly effort to increase the salience of what is most salient for your core voters. So you cannot just arbitrarily choose what to do with salience. It has to resonate with your voters, and then you amplify the features of your voters, both in the direction of bliss points and in the direction of the relative weights that you place to different issues.
Probably the last question there, and then I will ask if we have, I don't know, you have 5 more minutes after that.
Okay. So in the first study, you force people to choose an enemy, right, as you said. And so what I don't understand there is you have a large sample of people who have all kinds of opinions. You don't know. They can be all over the place. So in a sense, you don't allow people to choose the center, right? And is this a problem, or is this exactly what you want, or maybe it's not a problem? So, I mean, that's the question.
So we want them to think about their identity in a context of conflict, of political conflict. So it could be that you are already very identified as a working class, a blue-collar worker, or as a cultural conservative, in which case our experiment would have no effect because you already have this latent identity. Or it could be that you are a centrist voter who is not very responsive to these effects. And so that would attenuate our results, actually it could be one reason why in one particular case, this conservative cultural treatment, we don't find strong results. Because if I make you think about white pride and you are a black voter who is conservative, maybe you respond to that by identifying as black, but you are conservative in your views of abortion or immigration. And so that would not have an effect. So ideally, the ideal world would be one in which people are not currently identified in the dimension that we try to prime, but that dimension is sufficiently latent and strong that if I make you think about that, then you react. If you are very centrist and moderate, then we are less likely to find an effect. And in a sense, our evidence on baseline disagreement speaks to that. The effect is stronger, the treatment effect is stronger on the issues where the progressive and the conservatives are further apart. If the progressive and conservatives are very similar on that issue, we don't find much.
Thank you very much, Guido. So there's no more time for questions, but if someone wants to talk with Guido now, like 5 minutes, you can do it. So thank you very much for...
Thank you, and thank you for your questions.